We are getting started. Just wanted to welcome everyone to this exciting conversation today. My name is Kristen Urquiza. I'm the Executive Director of the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance, which is the alumni-led and alumni-funded home of Yale's social impact leaders. So we do a whole host of programming over the course of the year, from hosting these types of conversations with experts in our Yale family on important issues facing nonprofits. We also support Yale-led nonprofit organization through ongoing mentorship. Every summer, we help raise funds so that current students can take an internship with a nonprofit organization to find pathways into our field. And then we do a whole host of other programming to support the social impact space, including our upcoming conference, which will be at the Yale Club in New York on October 24th, of which there are both sponsorship opportunities to help support that defrays the cost of our free programming over the course of the year, as well as tickets. So I'll drop a link in the chat for folks to learn more about our upcoming conference. Those are all the housekeeping pieces that I wanted to share as we're getting started. Just want to say big thanks to our speakers today, and Lisa, for what I know will be a really inspiring and insightful conversation. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Lisa Rieger, who is on the board of YANA. She's also our board secretary, runs our governance committee, and is a social impact champion herself. So thanks, Lisa, for all that you do for YANA and the greater community.
Well, thank you, Kristen, as well. And thank you to Nick and Margie for agreeing to share your wisdom with our members today. At our last year's conference, we had a session on advocacy, and it was, very well attended and very well received. And we really were excited to be able to follow up and go into a little bit more detail of some different components with our panelists today. And we are going to go in order of Nick first and Margie second. Nick's a current PhD student, almost finished at Yale, where he's been really looking at how organizations advocate on behalf of their populations and looking at it sort of from a meta-analysis viewpoint. Margie is a long-term champion in social impact and advocacy work, and we are really looking forward to her wisdom and perspective as we're gonna have a little dialogue between Nick and Margie, and then open it up to discussion to the group. And I think, Kristen, are you going to monitor questions in the chat?
You got it.
Okay, great. All right. Well, so without any further ado, let's get started so that we can use our time effectively and have as much time as possible to hear from Nick and Margie. So Nick, do you want to get us started off and maybe tell us a little about yourself and how you became interested in the topic that you're working on?
So, as Lisa mentioned, I'm a PhD student in political science at Yale. And
your voice is a little bit not so great. Like, your voice is, I'm sure, wonderful in person, but on the video, it's not, or on the Zoom, it's not working that well.
You're a little faint. I did turn my volume all the way up, which helped. So while Nick is troubleshooting on his side, that also may help on each of our sides.
Can you hear me now?
That's perfect.
Great. Yes, so as Lisa mentioned, I'm a PhD student in political science at Yale. I'm in my final year, and I've been conducting my dissertation research on nonprofit organizations and how they are active in advocacy, why they're active in advocacy, and whether they are effective at advocacy.
Great. So I think you're going to launch us off in some of what you have been working on.
Yes, yeah. Is it okay if I share my screen and show some slides?
Yeah, sure.
Um,
Does he have share screen ability? Oh yeah. Okay, great.
there we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to start with some headlines that are probably very uh, familiar to a lot of people in the Zoom room, right? Especially in the last couple months, nonprofits have faced kind of severe cuts in funding, not just from the government, but sometimes from foundations as well. This has led to many closures, including one beloved nonprofit in New Haven, Iris, closing an office in East Rock, which is quite sad. And one of the causes of this is an excerpt from a kind of Trump administration budget proposal. Is this kind of idea that the government shouldn't be funding these quote niche non-governmental organizations with these ideologies that are antithetical to the American way of life, right? Um, as somebody from a from an institution of higher education, this is also a hard time for everyone, right? Now, I want to start from the place that social scientists, sociologists, political scientists, historians, they've been documenting that nonprofits and people who work at nonprofits are politically active and influential in local politics for quite a long time, right? And this influence has implications for how policies are implemented, how the poor are represented in local politics, which is quite important because often in politics, the wealthy are quite well represented and the poor are not. But what I've been interested in is that we don't actually know where, when, and why nonprofit service providers are active and influential in local politics. And that is what my dissertation, what the book that I'm writing right now tries to tackle, is under what conditions are these nonprofit service providers influential and effective at influencing local policy. I identify basically three main ideas. The first one is when nonprofits are kind of monopolizing the expertise on a topic, whether that's housing or criminal justice or homelessness or whatever the topic is that they have. Are they monopolizing that expertise? Are they able to go out into the public arena and say, this is the solution to our problem, this is what we should do? The second is when nonprofit staff are upwardly embedded in policy networks with government officials. I'll explain a little bit more what that means. That's kind of the main topic for today. And lastly, when nonprofits are coordinated in their advocacy, when they form advocacy coalitions, and usually I find that is most effective and most likely to happen when they aren't directly competing with each other for funding. So like I said, today, mostly focusing on this upward embeddedness part. Today, I'm going to start with, where does this upward embeddedness come from, how it affects political activity, and then finally, how it affects policy, which is, I think, kind of ultimately what they are interested in. So, I'm a PhD student at Yale, but why should you listen to me? I have I've conducted hundreds of interviews across mainly these three cities, New Haven, Santa Cruz, and Seattle. These are cities of kind of widely varying populations. Connecticut doesn't have counties, which is kind of interesting in the context of nonprofit service providers because counties usually administer a lot of social services. They have different kind of forms of government. What they have in common is that these are incredibly liberal places. New Haven is around 90th percentile in terms of liberalism in the United States, in terms of cities. Seattle is about as liberal as you can get. And they're all three in states that with Democratic governors, I think predominantly Democratic state legislatures as well. So maybe my findings, are limited to these places. In order to rectify that, I've actually talked to a number of people in Arizona, in Mesa, Arizona, and Phoenix, Arizona, to try to make sure that these translate. I largely find that they do. I've mostly focused on the service sectors of affordable housing and homelessness services. And like I said, conducted over 100 interviews. I've observed a lot of public meetings. And I also have a quantitative analysis that I'll share with everyone today. So where does this upward embeddedness come from? First, a definition. What does this upward embeddedness thing actually mean? I'm drawing from, academic research on this and defining it as the extent to which a nonprofit has political and social connections to government officials, so both bureaucrats and elected officials, right? The benefit of this is that you get some material resources, so think like funding. It's very helpful for delivering services, in addition to immaterial resources, so legitimacy, credibility, visibility, things that are also very important for a nonprofit when you're delivering services. This also facilitates alignment of goals when you are, have these political and social connections. You meet more frequently, you are able to align on the direction that you want to go on a particular issue. And it also helps you keep an eye on one another. So that's kind of monitoring piece as well. So the first factor I'm identifying is funding from the government. And a very common thing that I heard when talking to people is that nonprofit staff often refer to it as a reason to not engage in political activity, political advocacy, and lobbying. Alice, I'm going to use pseudonyms, by the way, throughout. Everyone's identity is protected. Alice is a nonprofit staff member in New Haven. She told me that she would never publicly criticize this kind of state level agency. I don't think you would see anybody do that. And Greg, who's a former government employee from New Haven, told me that you could only be so upset with me, you being a nonprofit, because you still need me to give you money to do your next project, right? Kind of a you can't bite the hand that feeds you kind of mentality. This is quite common among nonprofits, this fear, and among government staff that I've talked to. There's a real emphasis on trying to keep the partner side of their job separate from the funder part of their job, but this mentality is still there. All that said, funding I have found is also quite important in terms of connecting nonprofits to government officials. So as an example, Liam, he works at a nonprofit in Santa Cruz, told me that he would meet with the county a fair amount, but it definitely increased with when they got a rapid increase of government funding, both in the sense of we felt more of an obligation, but they also just developed a more collaborative relationship with the county. They kind of felt that there was an obligation, there were higher expectations, 10% more likely to show up for that meeting, right? On the other hand, I talked to Kevin, who operates a nonprofit shelter in California. He chose kind of a principled stance not to accept government dollars. And he expressed some kind of disappointment with his involvement in policy at the local level. So it's kind of ubiquitous in the system that if you're not a major financial player, they don't really include you all that often in the decision-making process. And this isn't out of any desire not to be involved. Kevin does want to be involved in the policy process. It's just that he finds himself on the outside because he doesn't accept public dollars. So funding is one aspect. What's the other aspect? I'm going to refer to this as gatekeeping, and this is the extent to which a nonprofit service provider relies on agencies or elected officials for resources, legitimacy, in order to deliver services, basically everything except for funding. So what's an example of this? I'm going to give an example of this because this is a little bit of a heady concept, but I talked to Bailey, who works at a nonprofit that collaborates very closely with the Seattle Police Department, right? They do kind of like diversion from prison programs, right? And she told me that locally, there, like a lot of places, there were these sign-on letters in 2020 circulating, asking everyone to cut ties with the police, don't work with the police. They did not do that. Bailey's nonprofit did not do that because of this close relationship with the police. She told me that her nonprofit would not be able to function without this close relationship, right? So this is kind of an example of maybe a constraint that gatekeeping has in terms of nonprofits being able to speak their mind, be able to do things that align. Bailey and her staff were very, anti-police brutality and pro-police accountability, right? But felt like they needed to kind of stay more silent in 2020 because of this relationship. That said, again, the kind of flip side of this is that this upward embeddedness carries benefits as well. These close relationships with bureaucrats, in this case, the police department, is quite important. She told me that she saw the police play really transformative roles, become some of their most important supporters. They can go places we can't to champion it. So they're integral to our ability to stabilize the work we do. The police were able to legitimize Bailey's nonprofit and her program, which may kind of sound kind of hippy-dippy, kind of head in the clouds to a lot of policymakers, but the police were able to legitimize it for them and really stabilize their funding at the local level. Okay. Funding and gatekeeping, they increase upward embeddedness. How does this affect political activity? How does this affect advocacy, which is why we're here today? When I talk about political activity, I'm going to talk about a wide range of things. Everything from talking with legislators at the state house, testifying before city council, to meeting with government bureaucrats, proposing new programs, educating the public. These are all things that I'm defining as political activity. Research in political science suggests that local elected officials in the United States consider nonprofits to be quite active in local politics, about as active as public sector unions, honestly. And this is especially true in terms of planning and implementing policy, right? So we have some kind of competing explanations, competing hypotheses here, right? Funding and gatekeeping increase upward embeddedness. They create these close relationships. It encourages this trust. It elevates the nonprofit's role, but it also imposes higher costs for political activity, right? It is the don't bite the hand that feeds you mentality, right? So I'm going to hypothesize that there's this kind of upside down U, curvilinear relationship with political activity, right? At a certain, the percent of your budget that's going to that comes from the government is going to increase your political activity up to a point, and it's going to decrease it. So I can't actually test that with interviews, so I move to this really great study conducted by the Urban Institute in collaboration with all these researchers from American University and I think George Mason University. They surveyed thousands of nonprofit leaders across the United States. In particular, two items that I was very interested in. The first, the percent of an organization's budget that comes from the government. Second, the frequency that they do 20 different political activities. They very much range. I'm going to run this model, and I'm going to kind of walk through what the expectations mean for this model. So the first thing is that we have kind of three ideas entering here. The first one is that maybe moving from 0% of your budget to 0.1% of your budget coming from the government really makes a difference. It gets your foot in the door. It gets your name known among the bureaucrats and elected officials. It gets you a little bit more visibility. And so maybe that really matters. That's going to be our green term here. That's kind of any government money in your budget. We expect that to be positive. We expect that to correlate positively with political activity. The second term, this red term, is going to be, moving from like 1% to 10%. We're expecting that to be also positively correlated, right? Not only because of the close relationship, but also when more of your budget comes from the government, public policy, especially budgetary policy, means more, right? When a budget shortfall happens, you don't want it to fall on you. Lastly, this blue term is going to be testing the part where it starts to decrease, right? When maybe 50% of your budget or 60% of your budget comes from the government. That's when it's really dangerous to make the wrong guy mad. And so if these hypotheses are correct, right, the green term will be positive, the red term will be positive, the blue term will be negative. And in political activity, like I said, there's 20 different ones in this survey. I'm combining them all into one, but includes both adversarial actions, like lobbying, lawsuits, kind of aggressive things, in addition to less aggressive actions, these kind of process-based things, participating in working groups, discussing grants, things like that. And I separate those out to see the effects on both of those. So here's the actual results. And what we find is basically support for these hypotheses, right? We find that getting your foot in the door, going from 0% to 0.1%, that is positively correlated. That increases political activity among nonprofits. Secondly, going from 1% to 10%, that also increases the amount of political activity that you're active in, right? That's that red term. And the blue term, when you're getting high 60%, 80% of your budget, it does decrease, right? So it is a little bit of that kind of U-shaped curve that I showed earlier. So focusing now just on these less aggressive process-based things, like I said, drafting regulations, meeting in working groups, planning policy, things that nonprofits do quite often, actually. We see the same pattern, getting your foot in the door, positively correlated with doing more of those things. Going from 1% to 10%, more positively correlated with those things, right? It's more likely that you do them. And again, when you get up to 80%, less likely. The 80% to 90%, for instance, less likely. How about those adversarial actions, lobbying, lawsuits? Well, it's a little bit more ambiguous here. The truth of the matter is that many of the nonprofits in this survey did not take many of these actions. They just didn't do them very frequently. So I instead ran a regression to say, what's the probability of this nonprofit doing anything adversarial? Any one action that's adversarial in the last couple years. And this is actually a little bit more helpful, right? Again, the green term, getting your foot in the door, going from, again, 0 to 0.1%, that's positively correlated with political activity that makes you more likely to do, lobbying or talk to the media or do these kind of more aggressive actions. Going from 1% to 10%, again, positively correlated. And then at that higher end, negatively correlated, that blue term is negative there. So upward embeddedness, kind of a double-edged sword on political activity. How does this affect local policy? And I find that upward embeddedness is mostly affecting policy by funneling resources towards nonprofits who already have close relationships with government bureaucrats and elected officials, right? So during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there was a kind of a massive influx of federal dollars into local governments in order to address things that were issues that were arising because of the pandemic. One of those was congregate homeless shelters, people all sleeping in the same room, and that leading to very high levels of transmission. Local governments got federal dollars in order to open non-congregate shelters, and a lot of them chose that opportunity to buy hotels or contract with hotels. Nonprofits, shelters, or homeless service organizations who were already contracted with Maricopa County in Arizona were the ones who received those additional funds, not new nonprofits that had never partnered with the government before. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying nonprofits who are embedded are more likely to get resources. Another way is nonprofits will use close relationships with politicians, bureaucrats to pass drafted policies and regulations. So an example of this that I observed in Santa Cruz, or I heard about in Santa Cruz, was one elected official referred to affordable housing developers as adjunct staff, helping them formulate these zoning plans, right? They're experts in this kind of thing. So I'm going to run through one example just to conclude. So in Seattle, they have this program called the Equitable Development Initiative. It was created in the mid-2010s after pressure from these advocacy coalitions to more equitably distribute the burdens of building more housing, burdens of density. It's housed in the City of Seattle's Office of Planning and Community Development, and it administers funding for capacity building to build community centers, and it administers this funding to nonprofits which may not have received funding before. That's kind of important for the story that I'm going to tell here. a policy that many of these nonprofits, including ones that would receive the Equitable Development Initiative dollars, is the Seattle Comprehensive Plan. This is revised every 10 years, determines zoning for the city. So how has the implementation of the Equitable Development Initiative affected how these community-based groups participate? One city employee told me that, I think that these groups have always been yelling and screaming about these things. And then the city finally decided to hear it and fund them. And there was some infrastructure and formality and recognition created that helps them get a foothold, right? This is kind of the idea that I was talking about earlier with getting your foot in the door, this kind of legitimacy and credibility that arises from interacting with the government gives you more legitimacy on other things, like, for instance, the comprehensive plan. Mahershala, who is a nonprofit staff member at one of these organizations that received funding from the Equitable Development Initiative, agreed with this assessment. He told me that funding was a big turning point for his organization. They had not received funding before. They were very skeptical of government, but when they did receive funding, it helped him make the case to his community that they should be more active and engaged in local politics, right? The result of this is that his nonprofit engaged in stakeholder meetings during the early drafts of the comprehensive plan in 2023. This was not the case in the last cycle, and now Seattle is discussing a very pro-density comprehensive plan.
Nick, I'm going to just interrupt you because all this information is so wonderful, but also I'm looking at the time, and I really wanted to give Margie a chance to give our group a little bit of real world, how this reflects in her extensive experience doing climate and environmental advocacy. This all resonates very much for me and in the work that I've done. Even to the percentages of government funding that you've identified. And I think that if you could wrap it up, that would be great in the next minute or two so that Margie can and make some comments as well. And we still have time for questions from the group.
Yes, I'm so sorry.
Okay, it's really interesting.
I'll just conclude, and I don't need the slides necessarily for this, which is just to summarize that kind of my research is showing that these close relationships that you develop with government officials is quite helpful in terms of political activity, in terms of policy influence, but it is a trade-off between developing these close relationships and being able to fully speak your mind. And I think that people can and do disagree on the benefits of that trade-off. And yeah, and I'll conclude. And I'm really excited to hear what Margie has to say. So thank you, everybody, for listening.
And I'm guessing that Margie has a lot to say about it.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Nick. That was really interesting. Let me say 1 minute about myself. Let me maybe add a few minutes of comments and then would be really interested to hear what people want to talk about from there. I have probably the opposite experience of Nick's, which is I graduated from Yale. I started doing advocacy work and I've never done anything else. And I would say that, I left Yale as an angry young woman. I was an angry middle-aged woman, and now I'm an angry old woman. And I think it doesn't, I see the factors that you're talking about, Nick, about how much is money and how much is relationship and how much is experience and how much is I think there's a couple other factors I'll bring into this from my own experience, which is also about how much an organization's mission is really about advocacy. Because I think that all those factors you talk about are true once a group decides to do advocacy, but many service groups don't do advocacy at all. And just making the leap to advocacy is a huge leap. And not every group is prepared to or ready to or capable of or good at doing the advocacy. And I think that's just as important as these other pieces, because if it isn't part of your mission and you don't devote the time and resources and learn build the expertise, how much do you add in an advocacy context? So I think that is a really important question that groups need to ask themselves about whether they should even be swimming in that advocacy pond or not, and then what it means for their funding, what it means for their mission. But even for groups that are set up to do advocacy, it there are a lot of relationships that and areas of expertise that don't necessarily play very well to doing advocacy. So that could be whether or not you take government money, whether or not you mostly do service, all those things are true. So I guess I would start by just saying, I think the most important thing about an organization deciding to do advocacy is knowing that you need a policy outcome that has to be decided someplace that you can't control elsewhere. Because if you don't need it that much, if you don't need the policy to change, probably you don't want to do advocacy. I mean, I think it's really fun, but it takes a certain personality to think it's a fun thing to do. I think it's really important and effective, but do you really need it to happen? And I think for groups that are set up mostly as advocates, of course, they believe it is important and it needs to happen. But for service groups or groups somewhere in between, research organizations, educational organizations, I think it's a real question about whether they should engage at the first point. And I think groups really need to ask themselves that. Do you really need a policy change? And is this the only way to get it? I think once you decide as an organization that you do, the most important thing to understand is what decision makers have the power to get you the policy change you need. A lot of the examples, Nick, you were using are local government, but it might be county, it might be state, it might be federal government, it might be legislative, it might be in the executive branch, and you have to figure out who can give you what you want before it's worth spending a lot of time trying to get it. So I'd say number one is, do you really need that policy change all that badly? And number two is, who can really give it to you? And then I think you get to the question of how are you going to influence the decision makers? And I think some of the factors you're talking about, what do you have to lose if you work too hard to influence the decision makers, are valid. But I would put all those questions into the bucket of what would it take to influence these people to get what you want. And if you're working in a city council or a legislature, you only need a majority of them. You don't need all of them. If you're working in an executive branch, usually you do need that mayor, or you do need the governor, or you do need the whomever. So, is it an audience of one? Is it an audience of many? And do you have what it takes, and can you build what it would take to influence those people? And that's where I think the questions that you're talking about really come in. Is it education that's needed? Are more facts needed? Is that the question? Is it political understanding of what the costs and benefits are? Can you bring in a model of what happened in some other city or what happened in some other state, or why this is going to be beneficial in a way that would prove out your case? And sometimes what you need is just straight up power, the power to actually influence a decision, which for an elected decision maker often comes from representing constituents. I'd say in America today, it probably even more often comes from money. But I believe in the first more than the second, so I'll stick with constituents are better. Money is pretty damn good as well. And I think the other thing is you need people who can convey whatever that information is in powerful ways and appropriate ways to each legislator. So it's about the legislator as the audience, or the decision maker as the audience, and then who are the right messengers to reach that audience and with what information. And so even in a situation where you have your worst case scenario, let's call it a service entity that's heavily funded by the government that really wants change, they can organize a lot of other people to get that change. They can play a role that's useful to them, but no group I mean, I have colleagues who think they have changed the world by themselves, but mostly my own experience is they have not. And everyone needs people, and organizing is honestly more powerful than doing it yourself in most cases. So I don't think anybody who does service should be worried about losing their power. They might have a path which would lose them their power or access or influence or funding, but there are always other ways. There's like a million ways to move social change. There are a million ways to get angles in and figure out where is your access and where is your influence. What does this audience need to hear and who do they need to hear it from? And I think that is what makes advocacy, a really important tool and one that anybody can do, whether or not their own organization is set up to do it. So I think this is where really understanding what policy you need and why you need it, really understanding what decision makers you need to make that decision, and then doing what I would call a power map of that decision maker to understand what will influence that person, who has the right access, who has the right influence, who are the right messengers. And that to me is the secret of what advocacy is, not thinking you do it yourself, but thinking it needs to be done and you have to find the people, whether or not it's you. And I think that's how groups that mostly aren't advocates or might have a lot at risk can also play a really effective role in advocacy, even if they're not doing all the work. And then I will have a bone to pick with you, which is lobbying is not adversarial. Lobbying is using the process to represent what the public wants and needs, or at least your constituents. And that is what democracy is. So if you consider democracy adversarial, which today perhaps it is, but it shouldn't be and it need not be. I just think we shouldn't think about these things as harder than they are or more challenging than they are. They are fundamental. It is fundamental that voices are heard in a democratic system, and things, even language choices that we use that discourage people from using their voice and having it heard, I think actually hurts the process. So I think any way people can participate, whether it's in a very light touch or a more concentrated touch, all need to be part of the spectrum, but I think we should be encouraging people to do all those things and with as much vigor and power as they possibly have. It can help them build their institutions and it can help them get the policy changes that they need. So that's my 2 cents on all that. And from where I sit, I'd love to hear what people want to talk about and try and see what kind of discussion we can have.
Well, thank you both so much. I wanted to maybe build on a couple of your last points, Margie, and as we put this out to the group. One of them is that a lot of, several things. One is it's really an important distinction. An advocacy group, an organization built for advocacy versus an organization that's a service provider that gets to a point in their organizational evolution in which they are seeing policy changes that would really make a difference to their constituency and being able to identify those. And I think that sometimes people who are down there in the trenches don't even know that they could change the rules, right? And so getting to a place where, where people are aware of that and then therefore will build the capacity, as you've described, to be able to influence the policy and look for those points of connection, which sometimes, they always say politics makes strange bedfellows, and sometimes our allies are in our least expected corners. So those would be just 2 points I would emphasize. And I'd also just like to mention, Nick, that Iris, is a close friend of YANA, and one of their leaders has been very involved with our organization, and so we're really, really sorry to see what happens. So, Kristen, do you see any questions coming up from the group, or we'll open it up now to the group to ask questions that Kristen can moderate? And
so far, we just have the standard recording and slides. So yes, that will be available, and it'll be both on our YouTube and out on email to all registrants.
I think the other point I would make is that an important point is there is a difference between working at the local, the state, or the federal level, number one, and obviously working at the legislative or the administrative branches. And it's much easier in many circumstances to build deep relationships with people who are in the executive branch, because they tend, especially the careers, tend to stay there longer. Whereas our 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 political representatives were re-educating every 2 years or 4 years or 6 years or whatever is the interval. And I guess I would just add my voice to yours as well, Margie, on lobbying, that, lobbying is as much education as it is anything else. And when people understand better, they're able to make better decisions, whether it's at the executive or the legislative branch. So,
and I can share a question just came into chat, and then we have Cornelia as well. So Cornelia, I saw you just took yourself off of mute. Would you like to share?
Well, this is sort of for Nick. I am in Los Angeles, and there was one kind of relationship that you didn't mention, which is that I work mainly in arts and culture and higher education. We often have government institutions that are fighting for their lives, such as the city arts agency, now the county arts agency. They're asking their grantees to lobby for them. And I've been trying to save the LA City Arts Organization for something like 30 years. And they're just hanging on by a thread. They're always hanging on by a thread because they're tied to the tourist tax, which waxes and wanes. The other thing I'd like to say, I don't work in the housing and homelessness area, but if you want to see what can happen when organizations get too embedded in government, you might like to look at a huge scandal that has blown up in Los Angeles with the primary homeless authority, which has gotten huge amounts, like in the billions of dollars, from taxpayers in the city and county, and they haven't kept records on how they're spending it. And that brings up, unfortunately, a huge issue that people have with the coziness of some organizations with their governments. I hope it's not true in New Haven, but I'm not betting it isn't. And I just say this as a citizen. Just check into that particular scandal if you want to get an eyeful. It's pretty horrible. That's all.
Thank you, Cornelia. That's I hadn't heard about that, so I'll definitely look into that. I'm sorry. I think your first point was about how some agencies are hanging by a thread as well. And absolutely, in fact, that was the case in many of the places I was looking. These agencies were losing funding and were on the chopping block, proverbially speaking, almost every year in the city, the city budget. And they actually asked, or maybe informally or formally asked their partners in the nonprofit sector to advocate for them because they have a limited voice within government, right? And it's and if, there is one point that I'm trying to make is that it's having allies on the inside of government is helpful and maintaining those agencies that you have those close relationships.
No, I mean governmental agencies that are hanging by a thread.
Yeah, sorry. No, so am I. Sorry.
Okay.
For instance,
we're all nonprofits are hanging by a thread pretty much
yes.
these days.
Yeah. For instance, in Seattle, their equitable development initiative that I was talking about briefly is always under threat of being defunded.
Okay.
And they asked their nonprofit partners to mobilize, and you had 200 people, and help. And 200 people came to a city council meeting to yell and testify about the usefulness of this program, and it didn't get cut. So I mean, that's a real story of how you can, nonprofits help their government partners as well.
Yeah, and rightly so. I'm all for it.
Thank you, Cornelia. Margie, I'd love you to jump in on this, and then also the question in chat, which I'll read aloud. Our challenge is there are too many rules to discourage funding for advocacy, which makes it hard to do right if it's not your core purpose. Any tips for how to fund advocacy work?
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Shannon. It's always hard, and it's especially hard if the organization is a 501c3, which most service organizations are. And there is definitely a legal limit on how much lobbying you should do or can do, and people need to be conscious of that. That said, this is a place where a good lawyer who understands how to do this is invaluable, because there is a lot of room for advocacy that nonprofits, even 501c3s, can do. They can do almost unlimited amounts if it's about their own survival. So that's like a little carve out that's always there. But also, the way to define advocacy is a really important question, and lobbying is a 501c4 activity, but all sorts of advocacy is perfectly 501c3. And so really understanding where that line is means you can worry a lot less about having money to be able to do it. So I'd say that's the most important thing if you have any funding at all to spend on it. And I would use a pro bono person for this, but I would not use somebody who does other kinds of law. You need somebody who understands this law so they know all of the places where there is give in how to do it. And then I think on the advocacy side, educating a decision maker is always 501c3. Bringing groups together to speak to a decision maker can also be 501c3. Educating your own membership and giving them opportunities to speak to elected officials can also be 501c3. How you phrase what you're asking for, as long as at the federal level, for example, as long as there's no actual bill in play with an actual bill number, it's all C3. So you can ask for your policy right then and there. Now, next week it might get introduced as a bill and then you can't, but up until it is, you absolutely can do all that. So I think people are more nervous, I mean, and for good reason, but nobody's tax status gets taken away over this. It is so rare. There is a lot more room than people think. I'd be careful about what you call it. I'd be careful about not going over the line, but there is a ton of room. My own organization is mostly C3, and we're on the Hill all the time.
Well, and I think the other part of this question, Margie, maybe you could address is if in the ordinary course of our, like my general counsel role, I can educate blah, 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 and there might be funds for that. But I think that one of the things Shannon was asking is how do we fund it? Like, and we can't get specific funding for advocacy per se. And I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of organizations try to get some unrestricted funding through earned income or, other funder types of models. If you could talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. So, and thanks for bringing that up, Lisa. I do think that there are foundations that this is what they do and they're looking for it and they're looking to help groups. There's few and far between, but they do exist, and I would look at that first. I'd say second is there are sources of funding that are much more flexible. So grants can be more flexible, but often aren't. Government funding is the worst for this usually because it's the most constrained in what you can do, and you have to report on it the most. Big donors are better for this than foundations are, and little donors are the best for this. So this is the kind of thing that even if you do, one big fundraiser a quarter that's public, use all that money for the C4 pieces. It doesn't have, as long as you don't tell people it's a C3 contribution, it doesn't have to be a C3 contribution. And you can use all of that money to do your advocacy and use your grant money to cover other expenses. So I do small donors first and foremost. I do major donors as long as they understand. I would do the foundations that you can do, and I would usually leave government money to whatever the exact purpose was. It's the least flexible money that there is. I've also seen a lot of places where like-minded groups band together, because there's going to be somebody in there who has the capacity, the financial capacity and the legal capacity. And if everyone's working together, you can split up the costs so that they're always paying those costs and representing the face of that where needed, even in a coalition effort. So I think you have to be creative for sure. I think there's way more leeway than people usually think there is, but unrestricted foundation money is fine. Big donors are pretty good. Small donors are really good for this purpose.
And sometimes, funding coalitions allows for advocacy work within the coalition.
Totally.
With the added benefit of you're banding together with others to have a louder and more effective voice.
Always.
Marcie. So good to see you. You're on mute, my friend.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. Thank you. This information is particularly relevant for me right now. I'm working with an organization in New York where I'm working with the board, a lot of board training. And I need the board to externalize their work. So, Margie, I wanted to know from you how you frame the role of the board in this work. Because I understand that for smaller organizations, say less than a $10 million organization, city-based organizations, what we're talking about, in the education and art space, funding is being cut right and left for, school-age children programming. I need to get the board more active in getting out there and using their relationships and their networking. I'd like to know your experience about that and any tricks you have to share.
Okay, I love this question. Like any kind of organizing, it's making sure that the person shares the vision, which I assume they do, or they wouldn't be on your board, and then understands there are a whole set of choices and options for how they plug in, but they're desperately needed to plug in. And then you can work with them to figure out the right piece of it. And I think, like, I'm on a board where somebody's just like, oh, we need to get into your LinkedIn so we can see who we're connected to. And I do stuff like this all the time. I would never give them my LinkedIn. Like, that's too creepy, right? But I think that if you help the person see for herself, and you have to do a lot of individualized work here, which I'm sure you're having to do anyway. Like, these are the people we're trying to influence, and what I'm looking for this person is a handful of people who have this experience, or I think you might know somebody who knows this person. Can you help with that? Or can we go together? Because I can talk about this part, but I really want you to talk about this experience. And then once you get the person started and then it's fun and people are doing it and they see the impact, it's much easier to keep them going and have them bring their peers in. But I think I'd try and pick off, Marcy, the one or two suckers on your board who are most likely to be wanting to do it and good at it, and come up with individualized plans with them, and then they'll start talking it up and you'll use the examples, and then everyone will see they can find their own way. So I think the easiest thing is to, go with somebody and help them see, here's 3 easy things that would make so much of a difference to us, and I really don't think they'll take up that much of your time, and you might get something out of it too.
I think we have one last
Thank
question
you.
In the chat.
Yeah, this one says from Philip, responsibility can be variously vested in different agencies and perhaps an NGO or friends organization. how to work around initial brick walls to take the advocacy to a higher level.
I don't know, Nick, if you have an idea here.
I'm a little I'm trying to understand the question. I'm sorry.
Well, I would like to clarify the question too. Like, are you talking about initial brick walls between organizations or inside organizations? And even in an internal way, there are a lot of different ways of talking about the same thing. And collective impact was really popular for a long time. If you have a backbone organization that can bring people together who are all trying to accomplish the same things, but they each have a different piece of it, if you can have conversations so everybody recognizes where their piece is, and then they can augment and amplify each other's voice. But I don't know if that's what you meant. So
if I could clarify a bit, addressing a particular board might have the approach of not invented here. They want to do it themselves in terms of a particular opportunity, say. And a friends organization can actually be very low level in the scheme of things. With the county government ultimately being responsible, say, for a particular agency. So what do you do when the friends organization is presenting brick walls? And unfortunately, it's not really transparent necessarily whether the whole board feels a certain way or just a handful of very vocal, members of the board. How do you deal with that?
I'll just say it's like any organizing challenge. You're right. You got to separate out who the problem really is and figure out who your allies really are. But I think that in general, most people on the boards do care about the mission. And so I would just bring everything back to that. It's not about, this one decision. It's not about who has access or influence. It's not about who's doing a better job or a worse job. It's really about we're all trying to get more funding for this kind of program. And I know you care so much about it. So can you find a way to work with this other person and me to help make this happen? I would just always bring it back to this, as Nancy Pelosi would say, this is for the children. And then she'd ram something down your throat. But like that, that is, I think, people have to remember their fundamental reason for being there and their desire to see the world a better place and do good in this particular place and be known as a person who does that. And you are just giving them a little better opportunity than they were going to take advantage of before.
That's very encouraging. Thank you.
So I think we're coming to the end of our time, but I see Cornelia's hand is up again. And
I just wanted to say that we should remember that all of us, if we're citizens, have the individual ability to contact every level of government, our representatives, and some of the organizations that I'm signed up with send template letters where all you have to do really is to fill in your name and address. It takes 5 seconds, but they're counted. You don't even have to go to City Hall. So you can do that. Your board members can do that. You can encourage, I think, any of your constituents to do that. And for organizations that are well below the 10 million budget, well below, this sort of thing could be folded into a general communications strategy and handled just, in your newsletter or your funding appeal. I believe yesterday I saw something that said now churches are allowed to advocate for specific candidates, houses of worship.
Yep.
That
Yeah, we're
has
not
just
for that.
recently passed. And if churches can advocate for specific candidates, where are there any restrictions at all? Houses of worship, presumably not only churches, but temples, mosques, etc. So
Well, thank you for that reminder, Cornelia. And
double check that one, folks.
and thank you, Nick and Margie, for your time and your wisdom and for sharing this hour with us. Thank you, Margie, for putting your email in the chat if anybody wants to follow up with you. I know I'd like to. We look forward to seeing you perhaps at our annual conference or at another one of our Pursuing Your Mission sessions, which will be again next month on artificial intelligence. Yeah.
Yep. Second Thursday in the month, same time, AI and nonprofit delivery. So pretty contentious topic, but I'm sure it's going to be good. And again, Nick, Lisa, and Margie, thank you all so much for being here and to the broader community for showing up. I think Cornelia left us on a great note. It's all within our power. We have, the ability to pick up the phone and call, people who we have democratically elected to give them a piece of our mind. And I encourage you all to do that. Do it every day, just like brushing your teeth. So that's what I got. We'll take care and we'll see
Bye-bye.
everyone soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you again.